Hello, and welcome to Theory Playtime. But seriously, the idea for this project came about because I'm currently teaching some theory classes, and teaching theory reminds me a lot of being in the theory classes, and one of the most fun things to do in those classes was to write projects. So composition projects as well as recording projects in other classes, they were some of the best, most silly things that I did in college. So, at least in a class. So I gave my Theory 4 class currently a project to do to write a piece for piano in binary or ternary form, or at least binary or some form of a rondo form. And they have to include a modulation, sequences, motives or figures, and a lot of chromatic harmony. So borrowed chords, secondary chords, Neapolitan 6th chord, augmented 6th chords, not all of those necessarily, but a lot of spattering of those throughout. So I decided to do the project for myself, not only as an example to the students, but we're all in lockdown and it's a lot of fun to write little projects like this. And it's not something that I usually do. I usually don't start with such a focused theory idea in mind when composing. So this kind of gave me, say, a quicker way to write music, actually. Usually I take a while trying to decide what I'm going to do, but this, I gave an assignment, so I just did the assignment as I gave them. My project will be much larger than my students' project, but nonetheless, it's kind of the same idea. So not only for my students, but for everybody else, this is kind of a good example of starting out with a chord progression, writing the part writing, which may or may not have changed little bits here and there as you go, and then adding non-chord tones, adding as you add the texture, and see what happens. So mostly it stayed, within the framework. The part writing certainly changes as you go, as you come up with new ideas, and a motive or two or a figure or two popped out and kind of stuck around throughout the rest of the piece. So as you're watching the video that's coming up, you'll see little things pop up explaining what's happening, and then I'll explain some more after the video as well. So enjoy. So now for a bit of explanation of the piece. this was an assignment for one of my theory classes. And for the first week, their job was to set up sections in either a binary or a ternary form and decide on their key, what time signature they'd be in, what kind of harmonic rhythm, so how fast the chords might go by, and then write out a progression that may or may not get tweaked as it goes. So this was what I wrote for this assignment. And the last thing was that they had to have some figures that they were going to use. So there were some requirements in the progressions as well, but they had to choose 2 or 3 figures that would turn up. So the other requirements of the progression was that it had to have some borrowed chords, it had to have some secondary dominants, and secondary diminished sevenths if possible, and at least one sequence. So I put in a sequence in both sections and some secondary chords, as in secondary diminished sevenths, secondary dominants, and just a slew of borrowed chords. So mostly this stuff stayed the same, except that a lot of the part writing kind of inserted little changes in chords in between. So actually, I believe this one has a bunch of added stuff. The C7s quite often had some stuff happening in the middle to expand the chords, make them kind of jazzy. And occasionally 1 or 2 changed. So the original idea was for this to be an A major, and it ended up being A minor instead. And you can see that I borrowed a lot of chords from the minor, so it kind of ended up working that it didn't sound quite right being in major primarily, but it was nice to have little touches of major in here. But basically this was it. And then I have 3 figures. So this one is used extensively. This one also used extensively. This one works more like it's a theme, a thematic idea, a motivic idea. And then this one used just a little bit. And then there were really 1 or 2 others that cropped up while I was writing. So this is page 1 of the composition. And you can see that there's a lot of things happening, of course. So I consider the rule of writing theory assignments is if you break the rules, it better be done well enough that it sounds awesome and you would still get a good grade. So it does not follow the rules 100%, as in there is some spacing things. I cross voices a little bit here and there. There are some gaps in the voicing that are more than an octave, which is technically against the rules. And there's occasionally some chords that don't fully make sense that kind of come out of the part writing. So let's go through this piece by piece. So my 1 chord, as soon as I get that G flat, it kind of sounds like it becomes a diminished chord. That's cool. It sounds nice. It works because it only is briefly there, and it kind of does end up sound like it's just part of the part writing. And we also have basically a 2 diminished 7 chord, half diminished 7 chord that pops up in here with the part writing, but it doesn't really change the function because then it goes back to being D minor right after. So that we would call those passing chords. I didn't bother to analyze most of that in here. I just occasionally wrote this, changing the chord in interesting ways, non-chord tones, same here, and then there's actually a slew of other ones that aren't marked. So it goes through a fairly normal progression of 1 to 5 to 6, borrowing a 6, and then going to the diatonic 6, then a 5 of 3, moving to 3, just like it normally would in the minor key here, but then modally shifting the chords. So there's a lot of that, just kind of either do the modal chord first, the borrowed chord, and then to the diatonic, or the vice versa, and it worked either way. Motives that are in here. So you can see motive number 1 is my most used motive. So that first appears, I believe the first appearance is right here and right here. They overlap each other, but then they are in here just a ton of other times. Motive 2 is right here. So that one's 2. This is 1. This is 1. We have 1. And then my 3 kind of became more of a theme. So this is 3 right here, starting there and ending basically on that D. And then that becomes a returning idea. So that also became the basis for a movement in the bass, which this is this generally moving half steps, occasionally a whole step, that pops up a lot through the rest of the piece. Sometimes stepping down to change it up a little bit, and then it becomes this figure that repeats. So that came out of just, as I was writing it, it worked, and it really sounded like it belonged there, and it needed to be used more. So that became a main thing to do in here. So now here is where this starts to feel more like a development. So the cadence in the previous section on 5 to 3 actually sounded like a cadence, basically. And in the meantime, each of these phrases right here, or actually all the way to that one, are hearkening back to sometimes the second motive, the first motive, and sometimes the third, which became like a theme that I was using. So then that's here, that's definitely here. So all of these slurred parts are little snippets or the entirety of that theme that come back. And it feels very much like a development. So it's technically a binary form, or sorry, a ternary form overall, but ultimately it has kind of a development in the A section. So when it repeats on the second time, it does not go through that development section. It's like the recapitulation and doesn't go on to the development. So a little bit more advanced structure things than I've talked about in my theory class. Here starts the first sequence of the piece, very slow moving, which is maybe a little atypical of a sequence. Usually they're kind of powering through it, kind of has a driving force. This one does not. This one lumbers through it. When we get to the next section, which is achieved through a common tone modulation, there's a little bit of a rhythmic shift as well. So I decided to go from 4/4 to a much faster 3/4. So this sets up the 3/4 with this pattern of 3/8 notes, which ultimately should make it to about the tempo that the next section starts with. And then we start the next section in our A minor key, after droning on A to set it up as a key change. So now this section has a couple key features. So there's, again, a lot of borrowed chords, but there are some other interesting oddities. So first is, in a music theory class, you're taught not to do parallel fifths. Well, this is mostly parallel perfect fifths. There is a diminished fifth at the end. So this E to B, F sharp to C sharp, those are parallel fifths. But if you treat them like they're a single voice, that's actually pretty common to do. It's just that doing parallel motions, you lose the independence of the voices. Well, this doesn't need to be independence of voices. It's just fortifying that bass. So that happens a lot with those octaves in the previous section, as well as the fifths here. And that idea comes back here. Okay, some other oddities here is this one. This is a fairly modern thing to do, where you have, it's a minor chord, D, F, natural A, but the bass is doing the D, F sharp A. So it's kind of both the borrowed chord and the diatonic chord at the same time. And it happens to work because they're kind of far enough apart, and they're not really crunching against each other, which probably wouldn't work in this particular piece. So you have to experiment a little bit and see what works. I want to point out that that motive from the first section with the moving a minor second or a major second is kind of brought back here in this section as we reach the end of this phrase. And as we go to the next phrase, it's still here and kind of moves up and sets us up into the next phrase. So we have it here and we have it here as well. That pushes us forward. Otherwise, this section is lacking in our motives and figures that were in the previous section. And then we have a sequence of down a fifth, up a fourth, with secondary chords in here, with borrowed chords in here, well, with diatonic chords, with a little bit of borrowed chords, kind of the natural minor diatonic chords. A lot of interesting stuff there. And then this, because this section felt so short in comparison to the lumbering slow A section, I then repeated it. So technically this has an A, B, B, A prime, like very shortened A section. So then once we go to the A section from the end of the B section, this end of the B section is probably the most dissonant stuff that's in here. It's kind of centered around a C sharp diminished chord, but as you can see, it kind of shifts through a lot of different chords as it goes, but basically has a descending line that really, really, really sets up that push back to D. And then it goes back to the A section, cuts it very short, doesn't go on to that development section I mentioned. And then this time, our chord progression, which isn't labeled here, but this is basically the 5/7 of 3 in the key of D minor. Then this goes to the 6th chord in that key, basically. That would be like in the key of F. So in this key, it's 1. So it seems weird to see a 5/7 of 3 going to 1, but it's doing a cadence like it's a deceptive cadence. And then at that point, it actually sounds more final than it should. And it drones on that A quite a bit. Very classical kind of idea, or romantic idea, maybe more classical, to drive you to D at the end. A little touch of that little motive that came in and ending really strongly on D. So thank you so much for making it through this first video in this format. I'm sure I'll get better at talking to a camera or to a microphone while I explain things. So I really look forward to hearing from everybody. So if you are interested in the composition or composition in general or music theory, feel free to comment, send me a message, and I'd be happy to answer. Also, I would expect more of these videos. You know, it takes a little while to write a piece that's like 7 minutes long, so it probably won't be every week, but maybe every couple weeks while I can manage, especially in the summer. And if anybody has theory ideas, that'd be great. I'm always looking for stuff to actually work on and kind of expand my theory knowledge, because even though I have master's degrees, there's still more to learn. There's always more to learn. So thank you for watching, and subscribe to the channel, click like, and I'll see you later.